Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this CSIS online program. I'm Scott Kennedy, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and I'm happy to host today's program, Can Multinationals Win in China? Lessons from Apple's Experience. I'm really delighted to host today's event, which is being held because of the recent publication of a very important book, Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company, written by journalist Patrick McGee. We'll hear from Patrick and three of the world's top minds on China's economy and doing business in China, Jim McGregor of APCO, Meg Rithmire of the Harvard Business School, and Jeffrey Ding of George Washington University in just a second. But let me help set the stage for today's discussion. Let me at the outset provide full disclosure. Apple is a donor to my program, a modest donor, but a donor nevertheless. And I want to emphasize, though, they've had zero role in the decision of whether to hold this event, in the selection of the guests, or any other aspect. At CSIS, we have a big firewall between our donors and our work, and that holds in this situation as well. We're doing this event because I think it's an important book whose info and ideas deserve wider attention in the policy community and broader public. And let me explain why. This book touches on at least four gigantic debates about doing business with China. The first one is, can you succeed in doing business in China? Can you be profitable? The second is, can you succeed without creating the domestic competitor in China that is going to eventually defeat you? The third is, can you succeed without sacrificing your values? And the fourth is, can you succeed without harming America's national security? All four of these questions are addressed in Patrick's book. And each of them has been debated again and again, but it's very difficult to get definitive answers to these questions. You can look at quantitative data that companies report about their business in China and their operations. You can do surveys like chambers of commerce do. You can look at media reports like the daily reports that Patrick and others have written. And you can look at in-depth case studies. For example, in their recent business climate survey, AmCham China reports that although their members are more pessimistic about the business environment and face a variety of challenges from the Chinese and American sides, the large majority are still profitable and only a small percentage are considering pulling out of China. In a more recent flash survey by AmCham conducted in late May, despite higher tariffs, export controls, the problems of rare earths, the potential cancellation of the US-China tax treaty, once again, the vast majority of their members say they are staying in China and not moving. So what is the real story about US firms doing business in China? Patrick McGee has written a very important book that gives us important insights into these challenges. From 2019 to 2023, he covered Apple for the Financial Times. He joined the paper in 2013, and he's been a correspondent in Hong Kong and Germany as well. Prior to joining the FT, he was a reporter with the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to turn things over to Patrick in just a second, and he'll offer about 12 to 15 minutes of remarks about the book and the issues it raises. I'll then introduce our three commentators, and each of them will offer their feedback on the book and the broader questions as well. And then we'll have an open discussion for the remainder of the hour. Those who are watching live can submit questions through the event page on the CSIS website, and we'll get to those questions if we can. Patrick, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much. All right, I've just set a timer, so I'll try to do this in 12 to 15 minutes. So, why I wrote the book really comes down to covering Apple for 4 years for the FT and realizing that we really didn't cover the company as a manufacturing company. And that really is what it is. I mean, in particular, in historical terms, that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's founded by two guys named Steve in a garage, and they are tinkering with circuit boards and assembling computers and rethinking the aesthetics of what the personal computer could be. And that's very much in the DNA of the company, the founding ethos of the company. And really, what happens is they're blindsided by IBM and the PC clones throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And those computers, really, until Windows 95, are not a superior experience, right? What Steve Jobs had come up with through the Mac was really a much better computer, but they were better at manufacturing, distribution, and logistics. And the reason they were better at that is they began to outsource their computers to American companies like SCI, Spacecraft Incorporated. And eventually they find Asia in particular, and eventually they from Asia they go towards China. So Apple is this story where, it's a very controlling culture and they don't want to give up manufacturing. But by 1996, a few months after Windows 95 has sort of gone live and you've had this sort of big holiday season of shopping, they're such on the brink of bankruptcy that, they've hired a Chapter 11 lawyer and they are days away from being able to make payroll. And so the story is really how Apple, in a way, finds a path to have contract manufacturers and suppliers make the computer for them, but in a way where Apple retains the overbearing control that it has, the sort of maniacal obsessiveness that one associates with Steve Jobs. And the way they do that was really this untold story. So I tell this sort of 7-year narrative from 1996 to 2003, where Apple is manufacturing computers like the translucent iMac that people probably remember in places like Korea, the Czech Republic, Wales, Mexico. I mean, I think most people just aren't aware that those computers were made in those countries. There's usually this feeling that Tim Cook is hired in 1998 to run operations and that he just sort of closes down the Apple factories and moves to China. And actually, that's like the 7-year narrative. And in the same way that the iPod is, Apple's late entry into the MP3 market, and in the same way that the iPhone is Apple's late entry into the smartphone market, but they just do a better job than everybody else, the supply chain story is fairly similar. They are late to offshoring in general, and they're late to going to China. But what they discover there is just surpasses what anybody else was doing. Tim Cook is sometimes called the architect of this strategy, and I think it's a misnomer. You might call him an admiral because he's navigating the seas of something that's already taking place, and he does that incredibly well. So I'm not trying to discount his contributions by saying he's not the architect, but Apple didn't build what was available in China at the time. Every supplier was in fierce competition with each other. If you just confine this to the contract manufacturers, I mean, they are fighting for 1%, 2% margins. And the way you make up for low margins is high volume. And so everyone's trying to win each other's orders. And by going to China, particularly after China has entered the World Trade Organization, that competition is just really fierce. And Apple sort of just rides that wave, as it were. Now, what Apple discovers in China is not tech competence. And this is pretty critical to the story. So, what Apple discovers is that abundant, ubiquitous labor, but in particular with laborers coming from the migrant hinterlands of China and going over to sort of a capitalist experimentation zone like Shenzhen, is that they realize something more than what a Dell or an HP or a Gateway understands, which is that they just see high volume and low cost. And Apple sees, in my wording, unconstrained design potential. So if you remember, Apple can't compete with distributions and logistics. So what they do with the translucent iMac is they redefine the aesthetics of the computer and then try to do some other things with iMovie and iTunes and so forth on the software side. But what they understand is that anything coming out of the mind of Johnny Ive, the ID Group, Industrial Design, and Steve Jobs can be conjured into reality on a conveyor belt production line that is able to be set up in China at real efficiency because of just how cheap the labor is and how many people are willing to put in the 12 hours a day. And importantly, also China's industrial policy, which was fantastic at attracting foreign capital and was just world leading with sort of establishing, factories the size of a football field if needed. And then not only the factories, but, the highways going to and from the ports or the airports or to get to the high-speed rail line, all the things that would be difficult for us to do in America and difficult for India to do as well, just to sort of foreshadow the conversation a little bit. In particular, Apple forges this relationship with Foxconn, and I really credit Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn, with understanding something about the Apple relationship way before anybody else understands it, which is to say, you are never going to make fat profits from Apple. Certainly not in accordance with your volumes and your effort. But what Apple will pay you in is basically tuition-free training. And this was sort of the untold story of Apple. So everyone understands industrial design. But what they're not familiar with is that's like the tip of the pyramid in a product development cycle. So industrial design is Johnny Ive and team figuring out the look, feel, and substance of the next product. They sort of throw it over the fence to product design. This is another layer of sort of genius within Apple who has to make sure that the product is actually functional within the dimensions that have been set. They're the ones fitting in the circuit board and that sort of thing. And then manufacturing design plays this role that I think is just as critical as ID, but they had really never been written about before. And so this is the team that flies from Cupertino to various factories around the world, but increasingly over time, Asia and increasingly over time, China, to train, audit, supervise, really teach engineering 101, and whenever necessary, install machinery into these factories. And so what's critical here is that China has all this great industrial policy, and they've sort of done this sort of jiu-jitsu trick where they've taken, in a sense, the thing that is harmful to China's economy, which is that you have a bunch of low-paid laborers, but they use that to their advantage to sort of attract foreign multinationals to set up in the country. And by training all of these people, you begin to build the tech competence in China. So to sort of fast forward in the narrative a little bit, my argument is essentially not simply that China is the only place where you could build all these products at scale and at that cost and at that quality, but that the reason they're the only place is that Apple trained them over the last 25 years. And the two numbers that always sort of knock the socks off of people is that Apple says since 2008, they've trained 28 million people in the supply chain. That's larger than the labor force of California. And that in 2015, Apple does its own supply chain study and realizes that they're contributing $55 billion a year into Chinese factories. This investment, by the way, is so large that people on social media, sort of almost dismiss it like it must be an error. It's actually really easy to sort of think about. Apple, according to Tim Cook, has up to 3 million people in their supply chain at any given time, just in China alone. And if you just take 55 billion and divide it by 3 million, you get to something like $18,000. And the reason that's important is because most of the money here that's being counted by both Apple and Beijing as investment is the wages for people, and it's wages because Apple argues to the Beijing government in 2015 that we're not just sort of ordering glass from Shenzhen and putting it on our iPhones. We are in the factories training people, right? So it's all an argument about manufacturing design, this unit that had been never really written about. So basically, what Apple's able to show is we don't have any joint ventures in the country, and you shouldn't want us to do joint ventures because what we are doing instead is far more helpful to your country. So, in my language, this is of course not Apple's. Apple realizes that it's the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, which is this ambitious plan under Xi Jinping in 2015 to sever China's reliance on the West when it comes to robotics, automation, electronics, and some other things that, of course, aren't relevant to the narrative, pharmaceuticals and so forth. And so this is when that sort of realization of Terry Guo really becomes mainstream within the Chinese companies, where they realize, oh, instead of viewing, to quote a former vice president of Apple as the prom queen, nice to look at but dangerous to date, they begin to realize it makes all kinds of sense to work with Apple because there's this directive within the country to move up the value chain, to sort of take control of certain industries and really become the world leader. And ironically, the best way to do that is to work with Apple because they will teach the hell out of your whole team and invest what really becomes billions of dollars of machinery into your factory, right? This is in the aggregate. So that $55 billion is a combination of machinery, but also wages. And the wages are counted as investment because unlike, say, a Walmart who's just ordering some stuff and it's coming to China, coming from China, Apple is in the factories training all of these people. And so it's counted under something in China called registered capital, which is a particular form of investments when you're sort of training people up for a production line. And because Apple upends their products every year or two, they're able to argue that, look, we never get to the stage where a production line is just set and we're no longer training the people, like everything's there. We literally have, all sorts of employees going into the factories, sort of at all times. Hand-holding, teaching. I mean, this is unskilled labor, but this is also working hand in glove with like PhDs at Foxconn and other places. So there was sort of this remarkable narrative, and I argue that Apple sleepwalked into this crisis. When I say sleepwalked in, out loud, it sometimes sounds biting. I think it's clear when I write it. I'm not trying to use it as a biting term. I'm actually sort of trying to explain that all of the Apple decisions made over the last 25 years in isolation, I think each of them is a rational decision. It makes all kind of sense. But in a longer term perspective, you realize that Apple's a pretty small company when they moved to China. I mean, their volumes are nothing like that of a Dell. Um, but the obsession with detail and the redefinition of aesthetics of a computer require them to train lots of people. And then the iPod becomes this massive success story around 2003. I think there's a single quarter in 2003 where more iPods are sold than all translucent iMacs in the prior 5 years, just to give you a sense of the scale. And then the iPhone, of course, hardly needs to be said, but I mean, they sell 5 million iPhones in 2007 and nearly a quarter billion by 2015. So you can imagine that if you have this template of we need to train these factories to get up to Apple quality, and then as they scale, they need to retain that quality. That's not some obvious thing to know how to do. You require that training. And so Apple provides those lessons in spades. And so you really have America's best engineers because Apple can really hire anyone just in hundreds and hundreds of factories across China working on all this. The other interesting thing is sort of the rise of the red supply chain, which is to say, if at home I have an iPhone from 2007, sort of disembodied as artwork. There's very few Chinese components in that phone. I think there's more China contributions than people realize because the metal tooling, the metal stamping, and all sorts of logistics are all happening within China. But nevertheless, it's basically a bunch of foreign products that have been assembled in China. That's quite different for, let's say, the iPhone 16. And it's quite different because once you're building in the hundreds of millions per year, it makes very little sense to be ordering components from, let's say, 50 different countries. This is a number that Apple gives. And in a just-in-time production method, you're going to have those sort of arriving on schedule, going through customs and arriving, the day you need them. That doesn't really make any sense. And so, of course, even though there's lots of US and Korean and Japanese multinationals in the Apple supply chain, over time, they're increasingly embedding their factories within China's mainland. TSMC is sort of a massive exception to this, doing the chips. And then over time, it's the Chinese, it's sort of, you got this tacit knowledge that's being engendered in the country. And the Chinese companies on the contract manufacturing side, we could talk about Luxshare, instead of Taiwan's Foxconn, in addition to BYD, Gore-Tex, WingTech. These are these homegrown companies who have learned everything that Apple has been teaching, like the whole supply chain, as it were, and then getting better at themselves, and then sort of squeezing out the Taiwanese, right? So someone in the book, I think I characterized China's plan here as like a massive brain drain of what Taiwan knew, and this sort of happens through the lens of Apple. This would, of course, happen with other industries as well. Yeah, so the narrative really is just that like Apple institutes these decisions in the early 2000s that make all sorts of sense. And then as the company scales, like no company's really ever scaled before. I mean, the iPhone alone is $2 trillion of revenue over the last 16 years, which is pretty stunning. Having all the processes in China has just been this massive technological transfer that I really do compare to something like the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, we really are talking that kind of scale. Going back to their investments, I do compare it to the Marshall Plan, sort of Washington's plan to play a sort of savior role for Europe after World War II. But that's of course for 16 countries. The Cook Plan, if you will, is for one country. And I don't think many corporate histories get into like the geopolitical world the way that this one does. But it really is that if you consider Apple a manufacturing company, if you understand their scale, $400 billion of revenue a year, and understand that 80% of that revenue is hardware and 90% of that hardware is all taking place in China, I think you can begin to understand that there's almost something commonsensical about this, that of course, that's going to have sort of nationwide ramifications in whatever country they happen to be building in. And if I'm just to end it here, I would say the story is in some sense, how did the company that built the world's most sophisticated supply chain make the rookie and calamitous mistake of consolidating all its eggs in one basket? And then when that basket turned out to be more of a ruthless authoritarian surveillance state than we thought in the early 2000s, why did the company double down, triple down, quadruple down? And what does that mean for Apple today? And indeed, what does that mean for the United States? Indeed, what does that mean for the West?
Well, Patrick, really thank you for laying out this story the way you've done so. And I think most folks who are familiar with Apple products are familiar with how they work and the way they shape their lives and the development of alternatives through androids and others, and don't know a lot about the manufacturing side of things. And you've filled in a huge hole in our understanding and what that means. And so really appreciate that. Let me turn now to our three commentators who are going to offer some feedback. They are leading experts on many of these issues in their own right. Let me briefly introduce them. Jim McGregor is chairman of APCO's Greater China region and author of two highly regarded books, No Ancient Wisdom, No Followers, The Challenges of Chinese Authoritarian Capitalism, as well as 1 Billion Customers, Lessons from the Front Lines of Doing Business in China. He also wrote the noted APCO monograph, China's Drive for Indigenous Innovation, a Web of Industrial Policies. Prior to joining APCO, Jim was the founder and CEO of a China-focused consulting and research firm for hedge funds, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and chief executive of Dow Jones and Company in China. He also was former chairman of AmCham China. Meg Rithmire is the James E. Robison Professor in the Government, Business, and International Economy Unit at Harvard Business School. She holds a PhD in government from Harvard, and her primary expertise is in the comparative political economy of development with a focus on China and Asia. Her first book, Land, Bargains, and Chinese Capitalism, examines the role of land politics, urban government, and local property rights regimes in China's economic reforms. And her second book, Precarious Ties, Business in the State and Authoritarian Asia, which was published in 2023, examines state-business relations in Malaysia, Suharto's Indonesia, and China. And Jeffrey Ding is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University. Previously, he was a postdoc at Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. It's sponsored by Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. He researches great power competition and cooperation in emerging technologies, the political economy of innovation, and China's scientific and technological capabilities. His book, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers, which was published last year by Princeton University Press, investigates how past technological revolutions influence the rise and fall of great powers, with implications for the U.S.-China competition in emerging technologies like AI. We couldn't have a better group to offer feedback on Patrick's book. Jim, let me first turn things over to you to hear your evaluation of the book, what you found most surprising. Also, how you think Apple's experiences compare with other American companies that have been doing business in China, such as Tesla, Boeing, IBM, and others. And also, since you were head of AmCham and you occasionally come to Washington, what advice do you think or lessons there are for folks here in the Washington policy community? Over to you.
Okay, well, I'll start off as a former journalist and author. This book is a masterpiece. It really is amazing. The level of I felt like I got an engineering degree reading through it, but it was also just really great storytelling. The personal stories of people like John Ford and Doug Guthrie, these China hands that were very different people. But for those of us who lived in China, it just rang true with so many people we've known there over the years and how they operated. Your marketing is fairly dark, and I don't know if you're responsible for that, but it's all this foreboding stuff, the undoing of Apple and America's quest for technology, deeply reported but disturbing. And questions on the legacy and whether Tim Cook should remain as CEO. I'd like you to address that a bit later on, but I found the book to be quite much more balanced than your marketing, but I guess that's how it goes in this political atmosphere. They got to get that out there. Again, the narrative was just how you wound these people into it. This John Ford, this former Mormon missionary who developed the language skills, fell in love with China, and kind of went over and built the Apple stores. And then Doug Guthrie, this more of an intellectual geopolitical operator who was advising them the way that, and many others, just to wind those personal stories and made it quite readable. For me, it was a trip down memory lane. I bought my first iPhone from a scalper in the Sanlitun market, outside the store because you couldn't get any in the store. But then, Scott did ask me to look at how this fits with other companies. And actually, if you go way back to Deng Xiaoping and the special economic zones, I think his plan actually was for the foreigners to manufacture there for export, and then the Chinese would learn what they're doing, and they have their own market. Till Barshevsky filed 301 cases on market access in the mid 90s and kind of woke up China. They had to open their market a bit. If you look at other companies over the years, I mean, look at Boeing, right? Every time Boeing sells airplanes to China, they have to do offsets. And the offsets are different manufacturing, starting out in 99 with composite materials, going all the way to a joint venture with Comac in 2018, where they do final delivery and assembly of airplanes. Look at IBM, personal computers, manufacturing and servers and everything else starting in 93. Moving their global procurement from New York to Shenzhen in 2006. 3 decades of R&D that ended last year when they closed down that staff, and they don't have a large business in China today. Tesla is I think is really the Apple of cars. They came in there, the Gigafactory, January 2019, they break ground. They're putting out cars by December 2019. $2 billion investment, China's government supporting them. The supply chain, 95% of the parts for the Model 3 and the Model Y are sourced from Chinese suppliers. They just sent their 1 millionth export car. No, their market is dropping there like it's dropping everywhere. I think, Elon Musk has not charmed anybody in the world these days. So did China trick business, or did China just have these talented scientists, hardworking people, and a smart government on industrial policy? You say, could Apple have diversified? Well, if it's working that well in China, why would you? Because the thought was, this is working fine. Where's the problem, especially if you have a good piece of the market? But when you start losing the market, or your technology is taken from you, I mean, part of this was the arrogance of business. We used to go to Washington, and these companies would go to the USTR or Commerce, and they would say, hey, look, I've had this stuff stolen. I'm very unhappy about it. And the government say, what should I do? And these companies go, oh, don't do anything. I don't want you to mess up my China market share. And there was an arrogance that they could always innovate the Chinese. So the question is, can MNCs win in China? Can they just win for a while and then they can't win forever? Well, what's going on now in trade, we'll have to see, because it's really, just came from a month in China, and it's really reinforced among some people that Xi Jinping's plan for self-reliance and focus on manufacturing technology was not so bad. It's actually bolstered support for him. So I think trade, on top of everything you talk about, is going to make things more difficult. I'll end it there, Scott.
Well, thanks, Jim. Really appreciate those remarks. And one thing that's highlighted in Patrick's book, as well as what you just said, is, a lot of people focused on IP, patents, et cetera. And a lot of the conversation today is about tacit knowledge, things that aren't written down. And that's really important. Let me turn to Meg Rithmire for her reactions about the book, things you found surprising, and also, since you focus on Chinese politics and economic policy making, your sense of how accurate the description in the book is about Chinese companies, the relationship with the Chinese government, and if this were a Harvard case study, and I imagine that there must be a couple Harvard case studies that look at different elements of Apple, what would be the most important lessons you'd want your MBA students to take away from this?
Thanks, Scott, for the invitation to be here with Jim and Jeffrey and Patrick, all of whom I admire. And I really did also enjoy reading this book. I confess I listened to some of it and read some of it. And I just want to say that because as I was listening to it, even my 11-year-old son was like, well, this is really interesting. I didn't know books in your field were this interesting. And I had to say, they're not. Usually, this is a narrative book written by a journalist who knows how to capture an audience and tell a great story. And I agree with Jim wholeheartedly that the personal stories are very interesting. And I'm here in Beijing now, and I have to say, I lived in Beijing 2008, 2009. And I remember the Apple store being such a scene. And I bought repeated, because they kept getting stolen. So I bought repeated iPod Nanos there. And my only grievance is that doesn't make it into the book. And I miss that product because I loved that iPod Nano so much. So But in all seriousness, I really think it's an excellent book, and just weaving these stories of, as you say, technology, geopolitics, and the kind of cumulative decisions that companies make over time. The Tesla example also came to my mind. So I want to just make a few points in response, Scott, to your excellent questions. And one is a little bit critical, Patrick, if you'll humor me, which is and I feel the same way about Tesla, which is, if they were to do everything, if they were to have it all to do over again, would they have done anything differently? And I think the answer sometimes, I think, is no, right? Because there is this huge wave of innovation and production going on in China. And to miss out on that would be to not be the company that they are today. And so I think, in a way, when we think about this argument about transferring tacit knowledge, the question is, but for American companies like Tesla and Apple, would China have caught up? And I guess I find myself answering yes, they probably would have. And so I wonder if you think Apple would have done anything differently. Some of the things that came out as a real surprise to me, one was just the extent to which Apple squeezed its suppliers. And, I've met with some of these Taiwanese, mostly men, who've been, put out of business by basically working with Apple. And so, but you tell that story very vividly, with a good rationale for why they, the suppliers who survived nonetheless engaged with Apple, which is really that they were learning. And just, slightly as a provocation, I wonder if the flip side is true, which is US companies, Scott, as you said at the top, via the AmCham survey and work I've also done, they want to stay engaged in China. And part of it is not just for the revenues, and it's not just for the labor. It's really for learning and understanding what their competitors are doing. And now China is in a business environment where they want to get those same things too, even if China is a frequently very challenging place to do business. The other, Scott, you asked me if it were to be an HBS case study, what would be the answer? And, there are many. Any given chapter could have been spun into a case study. But I will say, I think what's interesting now is that many companies, like the story that Patrick tells about Apple, were kind of driven by the supply chain. I'm going to call them the supply chain guys. And I know they're not all men, but the supply chain guys who were, in a world of open borders and, looking for the highest efficiency, lowest cost way of doing business. And the world that we have going forward is just not that world, right? It's a world where businesses are going to have to get used to redundancy, actually. They're going to have to get used to supply chains that are multiplied over different geographies to access different markets. And so if it was the, industrial design and the manufacturing, design people who were controlling Apple in the period that you study, many US firms now are going to a world where it's government relations and compliance people who are going to be in a lot of control within these companies. And I think that's an interesting transition to make. And the last thing is that, it's very interesting, the scope of what's called national security and national interest now, right? And the real reason why many people want companies like Apple to invest in the United States is really a jobs logic more than a national security logic, right? Because part of me wants to say, what does it matter, actually, that consumer electronics are primarily coming from China? I will say, I was in, malls today, and boy, those Huawei stores look mighty like that Apple store. It is very similar, but these things aren't maybe in a narrow definition necessarily national security. Jeffrey's work, has a lot about this, and he may disagree. But I'm curious, when we think about what's in the U.S. national interest, that's a different thing than national security, and just talking about jobs and things like that. And just lastly, I have to say, Patrick, the last few chapters, I was really floored, actually, by this observation that, we have this flying geese model when we think about supply chains. First they were Japan, and then they went to Taiwan, and then Taiwan to mainland China, and now maybe to Southeast Asia or India or beyond. But you added something to that, which I think is not in the narrative, which is that actually maybe it's not just that China wanted to develop the domestic capability to do all this, but it doesn't want it to leave, actually. It's not letting the geese get out of the cage. And that, I think, is a new addition to that kind of story, right? Because a natural transition would be, okay, now, they train up workers in India or beyond, right? And you're telling a story where they're actively trying not to do that. And that may be an interesting challenge, actually, for supply chains and for development and for globalization going forward. But those are my basic reflections, with gratitude for the opportunity to share them and to dive deeply into this book. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Meg. That's really super interesting. Having visited many of those stores of Apple and others, One big difference about the Huawei stores, there's cars in those showrooms in the Huawei stores as well. Quite interesting. Let me turn now to Jeffrey Ding for his reactions about the book, things you found surprising. Also, since you focus on tech in particular, how Apple's experience compares with other tech companies in China, and the book's narrative and story about Chinese industrial and technology policy, and then finally what the lessons of Apple's experience are for this debate about de-risking and now people talking more about decoupling. Thanks for joining. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for inviting me. I'm really glad to be joined by my fellow panelists. I've read Meg and Jim's work, and they've really influenced my thinking on a lot of my research topics. Patrick, this is an incredible book. I won't repeat all the compliments. I will just say the data here, these thousands of pages of documents, the emails, the internal studies, 200 interviews, more than 90% of the sources coming from Apple. Just really incredible work. And especially your point in your comments to us today about how we overlook manufacturing innovation, sort of manufacturing design. Jonas Nam and Ed Steinfeld have this great piece about Chinese manufacturing design and innovation in clean energy. And so a lot of that resonated with me when I was reading through some of the details here. Let me make 3 points. One is zooming farther out, is this just the normal order of operations for big rising powers? Number 2 is going to Scott's questions. What does Apple teach us about whether multinationals can win in China? And then number 3 is, does the US national interest win or not with Apple in China? And we'll get into some of the decoupling, de-risking stuff. So when I was on point number 1, when I was reading your book, I was thinking back to something I read by Mira Wilkins that looked at the history of foreign investment into the US. And here you have huge German chemical firms investing in the US before World War I and in the interwar period before World War II. So you have IG Farben setting up an American IG Chemical Corporation. And she does all this history saying IG Farben's science and technology was eventually translated into goods and services that boosted the US chemical industry. And actually during wartime, the US seized German assets. Like Germany tried to hide all these assets under like German American naturalized citizens. But essentially, for example, the Bayer brand of aspirin didn't recover its right to use that in the US until 1986. And so I think when I was reading this, I was like, is this a story that we've seen? What is different about what's happening between Apple and China versus what happened between IG Farben and the US? And I think maybe the answer lies in a lot of my fellow panelists' work, which is party-state capitalism in China, this idea of, is Apple sacrificing its values by working with China? And so I think there are differences, but it'd be interesting to pull that out. Point number 2, what does Apple teach us about whether multinationals can win in China or not? And here I'll respond to Scott's specific prompt. The company I thought about most was Microsoft, actually. And the training that you mentioned, Microsoft Research Asia, its second leading lab, which is based in Beijing. And in Chinese language, they'll say this is like the Whampoa Military Academy of China's AI talent. And so this is a reference to one of the big like military training schools in Chinese history. And so I think there are similar, Apple might not necessarily be so unique, maybe the 55 billion figure. I wonder if you map that onto Microsoft Research Asia salaries, it might even outpace that 55 billion figure, especially because the talent there is research talent, like talent that's producing cutting edge papers in AI. But I think I had the same thought as Meg, which is what is the counterfactual, right? Is there a counterfactual world where Apple, Microsoft would have gained more by not investing in China? And to me, maybe this is in the book, but I was surprised not to see discussions about global value chains and this classic study of iPhones, where 4% of value-added activities come from Chinese companies, and the rest come from, as you were saying in the comments to us today, Patrick, American, Japanese, Korean companies. Maybe that's changed over time. I think that study I'm citing is 2020. But China's goal with Made in China is to move up the value added, right? Move up the value chain from, sure, maybe we overestimate manufacturing and some of this assembly stuff, but they want to be in the design business because that's where the profits are. That's where the royalties are. That's where the licenses are. And I think if you gave truth serum to Apple, they would say Chinese companies have not necessarily moved up that value chain. Maybe that's changing with Huawei, other smartphones. But the global value chain and value added figures, I think, are important here. And I'll end here on the third question. Does the US national interest win with Apple in China? And I think here I'm looking at page 361, where Patrick, you conclude with Washington made a bet on China, a bet that free trade would liberalize the country and perhaps catalyze the creation of the world's biggest democracy. And I think you're saying that bet has failed. Sort of this engagement approach has failed. And I think where I live and work in DC, most people have somehow landed on this consensus. And I think my quibble with this, actually, my quarrel with this is engagement is not just about democratization. Engagement is also about peace, right? In my field, international relations, there's a huge literature that suggests greater economic interdependence between great powers limits the costs, limits the risk of war and conflict escalation. Why does the US not have as many tools in its economic arsenal to limit Russia-Ukraine conflict? Because Russia has insulated its economy from economic interdependence. And so is it a good thing for the US national interest that Apple is in China? That the fact that so many Chinese consumers wanted iPhones in 2007 and 2008 meant that China couldn't push a techno-nationalist alternative to Wi-Fi. And now Wi-Fi works the same way in China as it does in Santorini, as it does in Iowa City, where I'm visiting my parents right now. And that global standardized market creates more economic interdependence between the US and China. It might limit the risk of conflict. And so I think that's the thing that's missing in the decoupling, de-risking debate. It's not necessarily anything to the content of your book, but just how it gets framed, which is engagement is not just about making China more like us. It's also about making sure we don't go to war. But overall, really thought-provoking book, and I think it's sparked a lot of great discussion here.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Jim, Meg, and Jeffrey put awesome feedback, touching on many aspects of the book and the issues that it raises. Let me turn things back to Patrick to get your initial reactions to there's a waterfall, avalanche of comments, but sort of, high points of things that you wanted to offer thoughts about before we go to additional questions from the audience and things that I've wanted to raise as well.
Yeah, no, so fantastic comments, and I'm perfectly open to criticism, by the way. So unleash. Yeah, so just to respond, I sort of taking little notes. So Jim's comment about the marketing being dark. I mean, I love that graphic of the dragon eating the apple. That said, I will say that I think the thing I've had to combat most sort of forthrightly on social media or wherever is the idea either that the book is anti-Apple, and in particular that the idea that the book is anti-China. I don't think it's anti-Apple really in any sense. I mean, basically all the sourcing is Apple. I mean, these are people who love Apple, who work with Apple. When they text me, it's 95% blue bubbles, right? These are people still using Apple products. But of course, I do think they sleepwalked into a crisis. And if anyone has ever tried to, well, I guess you're not reporters, but if anyone listening has ever tried to contact Apple as a reporter, it is not some easy job to do. And so one big question is like, how did I speak to so many people? And I do think it's because so many people within Apple or formerly of Apple don't love how much consolidation there has been into one single country. And so they were open about that narrative because they too wanted to know more about it. And a lot of the interviews weren't so much interviews as conversations and debates with people. So anyway, I understand. Yeah, no, there is sort of this dark visage or what have you over the book. But I think when people begin to read it, it's dispelled from them pretty quickly. So maybe you're right that just like, well, that's just how you have to market a book. And I'm not really the marketer, but I don't think the book is as combative as I tend to be in interviews just because of my disposition, but the writing itself is very neutral. I don't know that I'm trying to convince you of an argument. It's not a polemic. It's not a screed. And insofar as each of you has a different reaction to the book, like that's just great. And I just want people to have conversations about this. It's not that I have certain dogma that I need accepted by my readers or something, right? So I hope that you found that it's written in that style. Um, yeah, Meg's question about would they do anything differently? Well, this is fascinating. So, a former senior vice president was talking to me a couple weeks ago and said, look, even if in 2008 we knew that the next ruler of China was going to be Xi Jinping and he was going to take us in this different direction, like what else would you have us do? That doesn't change the fact that China was the only place that could meet our demands, both in quality, scale, and I suppose cost. That's a fascinating answer, and I've been thinking about that for weeks because what is the counter narrative? I mean, in my total, hypothetical, I would love the idea of a NAFTA on steroids, where all the investments that Apple made into China over the last 25 years were instead made into Mexico. And in the Western discourse, we often talk about the China shock, just looking at U.S. jobs lost, etc. The China shock is much greater in Mexico than it is for the U.S. because, of course, Mexico, was a competitor. I guess to some extent still is a competitor to the lower value offerings. To get back to Jeffrey Ding's comments about global value chains. So, if factories were closing in Ohio because they couldn't compete with China, it was happening a lot more in the maquiladoras and so forth in Mexico. So that's sort of an overlooked narrative. I don't know if that's my next book or anything, but I think there's a lot more to be said there. Getting to Meg's comment about the HBS case study, I don't mention this term, I don't think in the book. Maybe I do, but I think if it's an indictment of something or someone, it's not Tim Cook and it's not anyone at Apple. It's shareholder first capitalism, right? It's the whole paradigm but we have a sort of system of capitalism where corporations are essentially encouraged to chase the lowest labor cost ever. Or wherever they find it, which of course means that any country that devalues worker rights, environmental protections, and so forth actually has an advantage. I mean, that's a weird sort of way to put it in a way. That's not how you would put it if you were, trying to gain followers to this movement. But that's the sort of the natural consequence that if everything's about cost, well, then it's not about these other things that we value. So how would you restructure trade deals to incorporate that? Also, just responding to Meg, the discourse I think is way too often about jobs. And often when it is, of course, our economy has a way of sort of adapting. So lost manufacturing jobs become service jobs. And that's sort of the end of the article often we were just debating how many jobs have been lost to China. I'm way more concerned, and any reader of the book will know this, that the know-how is what's being lost. I mean, 5, 10 years from now, I don't know that Apple is going to have the model that it has now because there's not a whole lot of value. There's diminishing value, let's say, of sending America's best engineers to China. I mean, at this point, what are they teaching them? China has world-class industrial clusters, and Huawei is making better phones than Apple. Frankly, at double to 3 times the price tag. So I don't know that the Apple model continues to hold because the student has become the master, to quote myself. The flying geese model, I love it. I don't use it in the book. But even today, I woke up to a message saying, have you seen the news that Foxconn is taking back hundreds of employees from India back to China? What's really interesting about that article, and props to Bloomberg for getting that scoop, is that it doesn't say anywhere that Beijing has directed them to do this. And I think, Jim's books are really good at this. And this is why I steal a phrase from Jim in the book. Voluntary is the new mandatory. You guys are the China experts, so tell me if I'm getting this right. But it feels to me like often what happens in China is like wink, wink arrangements are made more likely by the way that Beijing is able to set the tone. So a company like Foxconn probably doesn't need to directly be told in writing, you should take back all the people that are in India right now that are Chinese nationals with experiential know-how because we don't want them setting up shop in India. They just need to set the conditions such that that's an obvious decision for anyone running Foxconn. That is rather disquieting to me. Okay, coming to Jeff. I do think there's definitely a sense that this is the normal order for rising powers. That being said, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not familiar with these German investments into pre-war America. I doubt the German companies were consolidating the way that Apple did, right? It's not as though Apple retains 50% of their production, but hey, another 50% is contract manufacturing and it's all in China. It's all in China. I mean, Apple doesn't know how to manufacture stuff anymore. One of my sort of better quotes in the book, I think, from Michael Hillman, a 16-year veteran, is Apple did a great job of holding on to the proprietary processes, understanding how to build its stuff, differentiating it, etc. The problem was at the scale of 1 million components a day and 1 million iPhone shipments per day, none of the plans could be executed without China. I highly doubt that was true of the German companies in pre-World War One America. So that's the problem. I want to say I'm not against trading with China. The trouble is just the absolute consolidation. And that's really the value of those earlier chapters, sort of reminding people that Apple, A, used to manufacture things themselves, and B, did so on 3 continents. So they used to be able to do this really well. And Tesla is a very natural counterexample. And Tesla is also overexposed to China, but not to the same degree. I mean, the Shanghai Gigafactory is more than half of global production, but the same numbers that James gave for how localized a Model Y is coming out of Shanghai, I think is more or less true. Give or take a few percentage points for the cars coming out of Germany, right, from Tesla, and the cars coming out of America. Elon Musk will often say that the Model Y in America is the most American-made car you can buy. So that's quite a different contrast to Apple. In fact, if I had a rosy scenario of where Apple could be in 10 years, it would probably be where Tesla is now. And that's saying something because I don't think Tesla's in a great position. But just gives you a sense of where I think Apple is. Maybe there's one last thing here. Oh, yeah, the national security question that Jeff brings up is massive. And I want to say, yeah, again, I'm not pushing a dogmatic thesis here. I think it is quite possible that Apple, and particularly Tim Cook, has played the statesmanship role in the background that I don't have access to. But I wouldn't be blind to the idea that there are a number of things that Apple may have done in the background that I would love to be part of my narrative. But of course, they're not going to engage with me on this book. But it's very possible that Apple has played all kinds of roles, I don't want to say preventing war between the superpowers, but preventing things from going in that direction. I love this quote where commerce doesn't cross borders, armies do. And I'm very much in favor of trade between the two countries. And in fact, I'm very much in favor of someone like BYD setting up shop in Pittsburgh, let's say, right? I think the idea of 100% tariffs on EVs with no sort of counter proposal is basically a disaster. And we'll just turn America into some giant version of Cuba, where in 30 years we just have a bunch of gas guzzling cars. The rest of the world is running on Chinese EVs. And by protecting ourselves from that competition, Detroit and other places for car making have simply we'll just lose. Whereas if they're forced to, adapt to the way that Chinese companies had to adapt to Tesla, that strikes me as a better scenario. I don't know. Those are the main points. I'm happy to go on, or we can bring in the readers. But
Sure.
I'm done for now. Thanks, Scott.
Well, thanks a lot, Patrick. Really excellent discussion so far. Let me offer a couple additional thoughts, and then I'm going to let anybody jump in here with comments that they have. And I'm prompted by a lot of things that have been said this morning on the program. American stock market capitalism and the search for lower costs as critical, and that makes a lot of sense. At the same time, I watch Japanese, European, Taiwanese companies get into the same challenges. In fact, Japanese companies are the least likely to be willing to leave China. In surveys that are done, about 15 to 20% of American companies, about 50% of Taiwanese companies have been moving parts of their operations, only 5% of Japanese companies. So they are extremely cost conscious. They're also interested in innovation in that market. The flying geese challenge, and I agree that China is trying to keep as much as it possibly can across that supply chain. But China's a big place. And so, yes, in Shenzhen is competing as much with Hubei and Gansu as it is with parts of India or Vietnam. And they are all competing with each other. And so those local government dynamics in China also have a lot to say about where things move around the country as opposed in addition to just crossing borders because of China's political incentives of local governments. And certainly the way You get Zhengzhou, a whole city devoted to this company. Says a lot about Apple and business. I guess one thought that I had is that the book is about the capture of the world's greatest company, and I wonder if in some ways it's more symbiotic, and it might be you could have also titled it "The Capture of the World's Biggest Country," or a symbiotic relationship between these two where they both capture each other. They both are getting things from each other. They both have tremendous dependencies. Because I mean, one of the points that you mentioned in the book and that I've seen is China doesn't want Apple to leave.
Hmm.
Uh, if they had already been done using Apple and they could just throw them away, they could give the entire supply chain and market to Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo. But they're not. They don't want them to leave. And do they not want them to leave simply because of the specific jobs, or because there's still value that they're creating and transferring, and they want to be part of that, which says in some ways, despite Xi Jinping's desire for self-sufficiency, Apple still has leverage. Apple still has some of the leadership, and some American companies and others may too, despite everything that Xi Jinping might want to get out of the relationship. It's a relationship that he doesn't feel comfortable breaking either. So maybe it's a symbiotic relationship. It may have a lot of negative potential fallouts for both sides, but the divorce is something that they just both can't stomach. Let me turn over to anybody who's got some reactions to anything anybody has said in mine or anyone else's comments. Um, Jim, you got some thoughts you want to throw out on the table?
Well, I would just add, you're describing, these two entities, and I would say maybe it's more like friends with benefits, something like
Hmm.
that.
Okay.
They're not married, they're not connected, but they're both very dependent on each other, and it works for both sides.
I guess I just wanted to say I thought both Jeffrey's comments about, did engagement work? Maybe, right? And I've made this, I feel the same way. And I also am not so sure that we had a choice, right? The United States, when you think about it, right? You could have, Joe Nye's famous phrase, you could lock China out and have an enemy for life, but or you could try, right? But also I think what Patrick said, at the end is very interesting, which is that, it's not, even though he's written a book that some people think is critical of China and critical of Apple's values in China, right? It's not that it's a big, bad, scary authoritarian regime and no one not do business with it at all. In fact, that's not a choice. And so it's about something broader than that and thinking about the relationship. I think that's an interesting note.
Hey, Jeffrey?
Yeah, I'll just say if any students or researchers in the audience, I feel like Patrick's point about can you actually trace the tacit knowledge that Apple trained to then go into, does this knowledge, these talent flows go to other industries, right? How transferable is it from smartphones to electric vehicles to all these other industries that we're talking about? I think that would be a fascinating follow-on project.
Hey,
Yeah,
Patrick.
nothing more I'd love than some academic studies into sort of mini narratives within the book. And I think there hasn't been an incredible amount of academic studies. I mean, I've found the ones on global value supply chains and I've read them. The trouble is we don't have a lot of data because we're relying on Apple for the data. And they put out a list every year. It's something like our top 200 suppliers, and it claims to represent 98% of their direct spend. But it's sort of misleading in a sense. I mean, I've got the internal version of that document, and it's 1,700 companies rather than 200. Um, and so you can't do the study unless Apple makes the data clearer. But it's, if you're running a global supply chain company, essentially, which is what Apple is, that's proprietary data, right? I mean, that's valuable information that they wouldn't want to have out there. And so I'm not sort of knocking Apple. I'm just saying, like, it's difficult for an academic to sort of follow up on some of this because I don't think it's all that transparent. And of course, the more that it's in China, it's a sort of another layer of opaqueness. Um, Going back to the idea of like quote unquote how safe Apple is in China. I mean, yeah, I think it's true that Beijing has virtually zero reason to like cancel their export license tomorrow, do something crazy like that. And it's because, even the founder of Huawei has called Apple the teacher. There's a broad understanding in Beijing because Apple made it explicit in 2016 that like you don't know how impactful we are across across these major industrial clusters. I mean, I have some numbers here in front of me. I mean, in the greater Chongqing area at peak season, Apple has 121,000 people assembling its products. In greater Shenzhen, it's more than 400,000. In greater Henan, it's more than 330,000. In greater Shanghai, it's 700,000. Why would you want to kick out a company that is employing that number of people, especially if you have the understanding, as Beijing absolutely does, that they're not just sort of training them, they're not just paying them these low wages, they are teaching them. They're really allowing them to sort of get to a state where they could be hired by Chinese companies where they can then go sort of serve the national interest, as it were. So I think Apple's relatively safe there. However, the more that one sees Xi as like a Putin-esque style figure, the more disquieting it is that Apple's just sort of like fingers crossed, hope that things remain okay. That's a strange place for the world's most valuable company to be. I do find it quite weird that there's not a plan B. And of course, you know, the book does have a chapter about plan B, which is India, but I don't think it's as developed as the layperson or probably even certain experts are led to believe.
Scott, let me add one point on another industry to keep an eye on because pharma and biotech right now. It's really you know, the American and the European companies and Japanese companies have, and our universities have trained all these fantastic researchers and scientists, and they're now in the Chinese biopharma companies, and it's switched now that the American and European companies are buying rights to the Chinese drugs under development to bring them over, and it's something like 30% of drugs in the approval pipeline now are licensed from China by pharma companies here. So what does this mean for the future of pharma in the U.S., especially when we're cutting back on basic research? I think the academics on here might want to keep an eye on that.
Absolutely. This has been an incredible conversation prompted by an extremely important book. And Patrick, we thank you for all the hard work that you put into reporting this book and the way in which you tell the story and what you've shared with us today and the feedback and analysis that we've gotten from Jim, Meg, and Jeffrey. Really incomparable thoughts that add a richness to the conversation that we really need. This is what policymakers in Washington and people around the United States and elsewhere need to be thinking about these big issues. You offer some important information and answers to some of the big questions about the opportunities and challenges of American companies doing business in China and what that means for supply chains, for innovation, for national security. Washington, in some ways, thinks like it's landed on an answer, but in fact, the evidence and cases show that there's a lot of complexity, that we still need to debate and discuss these issues because it's a complex world out there, and we are grateful for you sharing that world with us. I want to thank all of you again for joining and the audience for contributing. And this is not going to be the last time we're going to be talking about these issues. They are live and we will continue to follow them. So thank you all for joining us today. And wherever you are, hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.